How many murders happen every day across the globe? Is it the police or the government's fault, or the blame goes to someone entirely different? What do you think? When it comes to crimes, there's a lot of questions, but not so many answers. So many unsolved crimes, so many lost people that were never seen again, so many broken hearts left. This story begins on a very cold night in January, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Life is so unpredictable, even at 1:45 a.m., when you must be warm in your bed having your best sleep, excited for what tomorrow brings. Little did we know that the world would wake up with terrible news: other murders. 3 people were murdered: a 58-year-old black male called Kenneth Sellers and a 52-year-old woman along with her 28-year-old son. Where can we start? Just like every crime story, even this story begins with a 911 call. On the north side, a man in the neighborhood where the murders took place heard a woman screaming and noises of gunshots. He decided to call and explain what he heard. After some time, the police arrive at the place where the shooting happened. They decide to not waste time and get in the house as fast as they can, in case someone needed help. Unfortunately, there were 3 victims. When the police got in the house, they noticed that the victims weren't standing in the same room when the murder happened. It looked like they died exactly where they were before the tragedy happened. Almost like execution style, said the police officer. However, each of the victims has a name, each of them has a story. The first victim was standing by the door, the youngest one, the son of the mother, a 28-year-old, named Thomas. He attended Central High School in Tulsa. He was self-employed. He was shot in the chest and his head. The second victim noticed was murdered in the hallway, the 52-year-old woman, shot in her chest. The house was owned by the mother and her son. They lived together. The 58-year-old victim, called Kenneth Sellers, was the last one to be seen by the police. He was murdered in the bedroom of the house. He was on his knees next to the bed. He, too, was shot in the chest and his abdomen. We can surely say that Kenneth and the woman might have been in a relationship together. His sister confirmed it and told us that he was staying there for a whole week. Kenneth Sellers was born and raised in Oklahoma. He worked as a welder for over 10 years. He came from a big family, the youngest of 5. Kenneth, unfortunately, leaves behind 6 children and 9 grandchildren. I'm pretty sure he is very missed. When the police arrived at the house, they noticed that both doors were open. The front door of the house and the back door of the house. The back door of the house didn't look like it was forced to be opened. It seemed that the one that got in pretty easily and knew his intentions. The house was in terrible condition. It's quite the mess, Sarge, says the police officer. In the back of the house, the bedroom had been tossed. The killer, who came into the house, was for sure looking for something he knew that it was there. Perhaps something he owned, something that was borrowed from him. There were clothes, blood everywhere. The drawers were out. What were they looking for? There were a bunch of empty plastic bags on the floor. I guess they took for what they were looking for: drugs. There was some blood in the bed, in the pillows. There is a casting there too, said the police officer. Detectives believe that the young 28-year-old victim was shot in the right side of the bedroom. Then he ran out of there while rubbing up against the wall as he is going. The wall had blood prints. Then he ran over to the living room, where he collapsed and died there. As they were going around the house, the police officers saw that there were castings all over the house. There were 9mm shell castings. As the team was searching for fingerprints and DNA samples, the rest of the team got informed that the neighbor that had called 911, that heard someone scream so loud, that was the 28-year-old victim's girlfriend. She was already transported downtown to be asked questions about this tragedy. She might know something. She might even be the killer itself. We're about to find out. The girlfriend of the victim has a child, a 5-year-old, a daughter. She left the child to her sisters to babysit. She was the first one to get questioned about this whole situation. The police hoped that she would say something useful. And there she was. She looked scared. She was shaking. Her voice was shaking. The first thing that came out of her mouth was, "Why did they do that to my baby?" She was talking about her boyfriend, the young victim, Thomas. The only thing she seemed to care about was if they are dead or not. She goes, "Can I ask you one thing? Are they dead?" And when the police confirmed that they are dead, she busted into tears immediately. The officer said, "I'm sorry for your loss, but we don't even know what relationship you had with the victim." She explained while crying that they had been dating a couple of months and that he used to sleep multiple times over at her house. That night the victim was staying at her apartment. The officer said, what happened. She started telling things in detail, as if the victim has said to her, "I want you to go with me so we can go get stuff from the house." The girlfriend said no because it was too late. They had to lay and sleep. But the girlfriend said that she does her washing at the victim's house. She said she washes her clothes and her baby's clothes there. So, she had to take some laundry from the victim's house and agreed to go without asking too much. The 28-year-old victim, Thomas, told to his girlfriend that his friend Melvin is coming too. The police officer asked her about this guy named Melvin. She said they were friends. Well, that they recently became friends. She says that Melvin used to always steal from her boyfriend, the victim. She says he came to her apartment. The police officer asked her about her daughter and who she was at the moment with. She said she left her child with her sister and her sister's boyfriend, saying that she isn't her blood sister, but she stays directly right across the hall from her apartment. The police officer asks, "So this Melvin comes at your apartment, picks you and your boyfriend, and you go where?" She answers with no hesitation, "We get in the car, me, Melvin, and my boyfriend. There was some other dude that I've never seen before," she says. Detective Mark Kennedy asked her, "What was the purpose of this ride? Tell us." She said that she had no idea. She didn't ask a question. She had to take some laundry and that's it. She says, "Sir, it was my only opportunity. I don't have a car." However, she continues with the story, "We arrived at the house. We go right around the corner to 29th, where the shooting happened. The first to get out of the car was my boyfriend. In the car, it was only me, Melvin, and the other unknown guy. The other guy that I didn't even know who it is, not even his name, left the car too." She says Melvin was in the front seat, and she was in the back seat. She says they were taking so long. All of a sudden, Melvin speaks on the phone with someone and says that he had to go and take his girlfriend. It sounded so fishy, like something bad would happen. She didn't believe it. She said to Melvin that they should wait for the others. He started the car, but I insisted and said no. She started screaming and saying, "No, take me back to go and take my man. What are you doing? Why would you leave them?" He wasn't even responding. He just drove to the corner of the street and came back. At this moment, she knew something bad is gonna happen. Or at least something bad just happened, but she didn't know yet. She said that it wasn't even a minute, that they just looped. And we go back at the front of the house. I go in the house and see that. She says, boom, he goes off and I see that. I walk in the house to that. By that meaning she saw what happened. Officer goes, "So, who is the killer?" She goes, "The man that went out of the car." But she had no clue who that was. The only things that she said were, he had a black hoodie, he was brown-skinned, Melvin knows him. The police ask her about Melvin. Who is he? How old is he? And much more. She tells that Melvin is between 2 to 6-year-old. He stays in Gilcrease Hills with his dad. She says that she doesn't know Melvin's last name. This information was so good for the police and for the family's victims that deserve to know who is the killer if the girlfriend is being completely honest. Detective Diana Bauman decided to search for a man named Melvin in Gilcrease, a man in his 22nd that is living in the Gilcrease Hills neighborhood. Luckily, they did find a possible match, a photo so they can show it to her and see if Melvin is the one that we're looking for, the possible killer. He is Melvin Porter. The detective shows to the girl a picture of Melvin and asks her, "Who's that?" And she immediately recognizes him. She says that he is the one that she is talking about. The investigators ask her, "Let's go back to the beginning. Tell us the previous story that Melvin and the victim had." She says that probably a week and a half ago, the victim, her boyfriend, gave Melvin $300 to buy him a gun, a 9mm handgun, but Melvin never gave him the gun. He kept the gun for himself, and this is why they had fallen out. She believes that everything started because of this argument between Melvin and the victim. Everything about the gun. So, when did they make up? They asked her. They had made up and become friends on the same day that the victim was shot to death. She said because apparently, Melvin gave back everything he owned to the 28-year-old victim. The investigators asked her if her boyfriend sold drugs. She told the police that the victim used to sell drugs. "I know he previously has. He just did 17 months for that," she says. They asked her about what kind of drugs he sold. Marijuana, cocaine, but she didn't know. As Detective Mark Kennedy was talking with the girlfriend's victim, some of the police officers also went to her house to check out her child, only to find out that she had left her child alone in her house and lied about it. Her daughter is only 5-year-old. How can you leave a child alone at home with everything that's going around the world? Since she lied about this, what about other stuff? Can we trust her? Is there more to the story? Detective Mark Kennedy asked her about her daughter and she admitted to leaving her child at home but insisted that everything she said was true and she could be trusted. She felt sorry for leaving her daughter alone in the apartment. The Petrel went into searching for the 25 Melvin Porter in Gilcrease Hills, hoping that his story is gonna match with the girl's story. This was a brutal crime that 3 people died from it. I want to know who did it, says Detective Mark Kennedy. 3 hours later, patrol radio hits with the news that they found him and arrested him for drug trafficking. He had drugs, meth, he had 37 grams on him. It was time to hear Melvin's story. Detective Mark Kennedy introduces himself to Melvin and starts asking him questions. Melvin seemed so chill, not nervous at all, saying that he had nothing to do with the triple homicide and that he hadn't been there that night, only some hours before, but not when they were shot to death. He tells that he was there that day, at the victim's house, and told who it was there, his friend, his mom, and Thomas's mother's boyfriend. He says that Melvin and the victim were childhood friends. Melvin explained what kind of car he was driving, Ford Focus, what hour, and where he went next. When the police told him about what the victim's girlfriend told him, he just laughed and said that it wasn't true. Melvin said, "That's stupid. I don't care what she said to you all. I wasn't with her that night." He doesn't seem to like the victim's girlfriend. The detective notices and asks him what's your problem with her. He kept saying how she always used to steal from the victim, how she always used to be high on drugs, how she always used to stalk behind the victim's back. The detective asks Melvin if he has ever bought a gun for the victim, as the girl said. But Melvin said no. He said that he bought the gun for himself. "Where's the gun?" asks Detective Kennedy. Melvin said that he took the gun to clean it, saying that he has the receipt too. The detective asks him when was the last time he was in contact with the victim. He says that it was that day of the death of the victim and that he called him asking for drugs, for some weed. "But that didn't happen. What about the meth you had today with you?" asks Kennedy. "Did you take that from him?" "No," says Melvin. The police don't know what to believe anymore and time was running fast. Detective Mark Kennedy asks for evidence for a surveillance video of the victim's girlfriend's apartment. He might find a video of the entrance of her apartment. But then Detective Bauman goes through Melvin's phone and finds some very helpful texts. They discover a text that he shared with the 28-year-old victim, saying, "Bro, what's taking so long?" Does that mean that the girlfriend's victim was right? Melvin was there waiting in the car that night right outside the victim's house. The detective asks Melvin about this text and he says that he meant it for today. That they talked about finding him drugs but it didn't happen. Melvin still gives nothing. No clues. The girlfriend's victim gets arrested for child neglect. Melvin gets arrested for drug trafficking. But there's still a third person that we don't know who he is and what he did yet. Maybe he is the answer to all this messy big puzzle. They decided once again to look closer to Melvin's texts. Nowadays you can find a lot about a person through his phone. CPL Nathan Schilling discovered that Melvin texted someone that day before midnight saying, "Need a gun," hours before the murder happened. We're getting closer to finding out, I think. The same person that Melvin texted, that person texted back hours after the murder time saying, "I need some clean clothes, bro." His name was Christopher President. This person got some explaining to do. It seemed like he is the shooter. Investigators do their work and they find a pic of Christopher President. Some information. Christopher President, a 27-year-old black man, was charged with a lot of stuff, burglary, drug possession, and much more. A father, has a son, a wife, a family. The investigation in Melvin's phone continues. They find that after the shooting, that night, Melvin has searched on Google about news about this case and downloaded a police scanner app. Melvin has been lying all this time, meaning that he is guilty of something. Is Christopher President the shooter, and Melvin's just a getaway ride? Getaway of a cold, brutal murder. All of this progress was made within just 48 hours. 2 days later, the videos of the girlfriend's victim's entrance apartment were sent to the office. Melvin said he never came to the girlfriend's house, so let's see the truth. And there it was, Melvin's car, a Ford Focus, just like he said, matching the same time frame. The girlfriend's victim was right all this time. Melvin was at her house, picking up both the girlfriend and the victim, then driving to the house where the shooting made place. The video was clear. Melvin wasn't who he said he was. 1 month into the investigation, the officers decide that they have enough proofs to charge Melvin for murder. He was still in jail for drug trafficking. It's his last chance to tell us exactly what happened and all about this Christopher President guy. So they went to Osage County Jail and Sheriff's Office, where he was being held. The detective started asking questions. Melvin still kept denying it. Nearly 3 weeks later, Margaret Hain Bell, Tulsa PD, discovered by locating the locations of both Melvin and Christopher's phones around that same time when the murder took place and found out that these two were together that night at the victims' locations. 1 month into the investigation, and they decide that it is enough evidence and decide to arrest Melvin. Now it was time for that detective Mark Kennedy to collect the DNA of fingerprints and the samples of the crime scene and see if it would match with our wanted Christopher President. After 2 weeks of searching for Christopher, the gang unit found him at his mother's house, arrested him for an unrelated outstanding warrant. The detective started to ask him questions, and after that, he would serve Christopher with his DNA buccal swab. He seemed nervous. They asked him about that the night of January 16th. He said that he has known about this case since his friend was arrested. His friend is Melvin. He knew the 28-year-old victim too, saying that he was friends with him too, that he was been at his house several weeks before he got shot to death. When asked if he was with Melvin that night, Christopher said no. He said that on the 15th of January, hours before the murder, his girlfriend gave birth to a boy. He was at the hospital. Melvin called just to say congrats to him, so Christopher asked for some drugs, pills, or something from Melvin since he got anxious about the fact that he became a father. He couldn't sleep. It helps with my anxiety, he says. So they went to a bar. They went to a bar near his mother's house, near the victim's house. After the bar, Melvin drove him back to the hospital by his car, a Ford Focus. The detective asks about where he spent the rest of the night, and he says at the hospital. But his phone tells a different story. Christopher is making up a whole other story, so the investigator tells him the GPA coordinates, everything, and that night he was near the victim's house. The detective decides to call the lab and make the case even stronger. To see if his DNA profile matches, they asked him to open his mouth so they can take pieces of his DNA. After some time of waiting, the lab found no matches with Christopher's DNA. Kinda disappointing. However, the investigators put everything together, every piece of evidence, and the court decided to charge Christopher President with murder. They decided there was enough evidence. Christopher President was convicted of 3 counts of felony murder and 1 count of armed robbery. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Melvin, on the other hand, was convicted of 3 counts of felony murder and 1 count of armed robbery. He was too sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The 28-year-old victim's girlfriend pleaded guilty to child neglect and was sentenced to a 3-year suspended sentence and probation. However, she was not charged in connection with murders. The victim's girlfriend was a very big help in this case. This was a very brutal crime that has come to an end finally. This happened only because people are greedy. Greedy for money, drugs, for having things that don't belong to them. So greedy that sometimes they forget the value of life. How precious life is. How can you take innocent people's lives? People shouldn't suffer. Their life shouldn't end for others people wants. But who is to blame really? Police, government, people, you choose.